Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Lunch Update, our program that helps you stay curious, connected, informed, live, and in real time. This conversation, like all Lunch Update programs, are made possible by our presenting sponsor, Perkins Coie, with a special thanks to our other sponsors, our Accelerate sponsor, Baker Tilly, and our small and emerging business sponsor, Easy Office Products. As always, we record these and we make them available on madisonbiz.com, so you can go in a little bit later and you'll have everything that you would want to see as it pertains to today. If you want to share it with others, go back and replay a moment. It's all recorded and posted for you to see. Coming up, we will be joined by two fascinating guests who are also friends of mine and the organization to discuss state issues, elections, and more. But first, I have a few chamber updates for you. 1 week from today, from 4 to 6 p.m., we'll be at the Adria, which is going to be the location for our latest big night out. And you can join us for drinks and appetizers and some great networking at one of downtown Madison's newest apartment buildings. We all see the construction going on across the region, but this one overlooks Lake Monona with a spectacular view. The event is free for chamber members, and you can register now at madisonbiz.com. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors publicly, and so thank you to our lead sponsor, Johnson Financial Group, our Accelerate sponsors, 1901 Incorporated, EUA, GHC, Group Health Cooperative of South Central Wisconsin, and U.S. Bank, and then our small emerging business sponsor that we like to be able to do to showcase those small businesses that make things run, sponsored by Aberdeen Consulting. The venue sponsor is Apex Property Management, and the design sponsor, as we go through some logo changes, is Kennedy C. Also, if you're one of the 1,200 plus people that'll be joining us for our sold out 70th annual dinner, we sold out in 3 days. Kind of amazing to sell more than 1,200 tickets in 3 days. We will look forward to seeing you live and in person from the stage at Monona Terrace on October 17th. Look for more details, including a speaker announcement coming soon. We're pretty excited about the speaker we have, and we think you will be too. And a few weeks from now, we will be returning to San Francisco as we come to the final stage and culmination of our 10th annual Pressure Chamber Initiative. The delegation is comprised of companies, both the Golden Suitcase winner, so those who won on stage in the live pitch competition, but also a handful that we will curate that represent our region and the technology and opportunity that's here. And we will introduce them to some of the top Silicon Valley and the country's largest and most active investment firms. Included in our delegation will be the winner, as I said, of the Golden Suitcase Child Health Imprints, a neonatal data solutions company that won during Forward Fest. And so we look forward to taking them with us and reporting back how it goes. We have two primary objectives with Pressure Chamber. If you've been, you know, but if you haven't, you should go next year. But the idea is to connect new and emerging companies to potential customers and investors, and to help amplify the innovation that's occurring in Greater Madison by creating stronger connectivity to key investment hubs like the West Coast. As we reflect on a decade of this work, we are proud of the impact, and the numbers speak for themselves. Now, as we transition to politics and sort of the state of where we find ourselves, it's my pleasure to welcome in our first guest today, Ryan Murray. Ryan Murray serves as a partner at the firm Consulting. His background in state government includes serving as a gubernatorial deputy chief of staff, a deputy cabinet secretary, a Senate chief of staff, communications director for the Senate Republican caucus. So has been in both sides of the building and certainly brings a tremendous amount of insight. In addition to his government service, he was a founding board member of the Bright Star Wisconsin Foundation and a board member of the WMEP, the Wisconsin Manufacturing Extension Partnership. He's a native of Superior. He attended the University of Wisconsin-Superior and Macalester College. So with that, Ryan, welcome.
Great. Thanks, Zach. Great to be here.
It's good to see you. Thanks for spending some time with us. So let's start with elections. It's something that's certainly making news, even international news. The legislature, the Senate's recent removal of the state's election chief, and some of the activities surrounding a potential recall at the Supreme Court. So let's just start there. I'm curious as to what you're hearing within the political circles on both sides of the aisles around those actions. Is it really just partisan on both sides, and each side sees it one way, or is there some discussion about ways that we're going to work our way through some of these election challenges.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's I think each party's kind of battling different things in this regard, and I think it's easy sometimes for folks to see, one side or the other or both sides taking convenient positions for their side and to mistake that for insincerity. I think that there is a lot of sincere disagreement amongst elected officials on how our elections are administered, the proper role of the courts, things like that. So sometimes things are and appear, very partisan. But in talking with members on both sides, I do think there's a lot of sincerity on these issues. Republicans, in particular, just to focus on them a little bit, since they're currently in charge. I mean, they are cross-pressured in a way that I haven't seen in 20 years of state politics. These are members who go home to their districts. They attend, county Republican Party events, things like that, and they show up and they are the least popular people in the room, and they are getting, in some cases, literally yelled at. There are resolutions for the removal of Republican elected officials, or kicking them out of the local party. And there's just a tremendous amount of anger from the 2020 election. Regardless of whether folks think that is well placed or misplaced, it is out there and it is sincere. And I think you're seeing Republican elected officials trying to figure out how to, kind of walk that line between placating some of their base and still, engaging in a functioning government. So I think, what occurred with the elections administrator with Megan Wolf, I think is, the culmination of, several years worth of frustration over the way not just 2020 was conducted, but, election administration in general. I think, again, Republicans, I think, believe that many of the rules have often been tilted against them, going back, well beyond 2020. And in some ways, the idea that elections are quote unquote stolen, predates 2020 by decades. But I think having a president of the United States who was happy to fan those flames, changed the game in a big way. So you're really seeing Republicans trying to deal with that. In terms of impeachment, I think that there is, again, I think there's a sincere concern about the way our new justice campaigned. I hear from Republicans who say, imagine being a criminal defendant, and the day before your trial starts, you see the judge quoted in the paper saying that he or she thinks you're guilty. Can you really walk into court the next day and expect that you're going to get a fair trial? And then I hear, from Democrats saying, this is nothing different. She didn't do anything that candidates haven't been doing for decades, expressing her values, and her opinions on kind of larger topics, but not specific cases. And that this is all just a very convenient way of Republicans trying to avoid a redistricting issue. And
right. I mean, redistricting is the issue. I mean, or one of the big issues, right? And
right.
So we certainly saw last week, Assembly Republicans, one Democrat approved a proposal that they're saying is modeled after the Iowa version. And I mean, what's the political landscape there? It used to be on the Republican side, maps are fine. Maps are carved out the way they should be. We don't need an Iowa style nonpartisan version. And now we're talking about it. Is it only the realization that what could happen at the Supreme Court necessitates movement from the Republicans, or is there more there, that there's been some other sort of awakening within the Republican Party that this is truly a better solution?
No, I mean, I think obviously the change in the Supreme Court is driving all of the policy proposals and changes being seen by Republicans. I mean, I think it's really hard to overstate how much redistricting is flavoring every conversation on every issue in the state capitol right now. This is something that, all incumbents, I mean, especially Republicans, but really all incumbents are very concerned about. I've been around for a few redistricting, and usually the most angry incumbents over new maps are not the ones that get paired up or put into, have their districts flipped to different party preferences, but the ones that go from like 65% safe to 55%. You have incumbents who are not used to campaigning, who are suddenly going to have to run campaigns. And I think there's going to be quite a few of those. So, as I, represent a number of clients on a lot of different issues, you're finding a legislature that is just increasingly less interested in doing substantive policy for this session. very much waiting to see how redistricting is going to turn out, whether incumbents are going to get paired, whether districts are going to flip, and that sort of thing. It's becoming really
What's
difficult.
your take on it? Does this get sorted out at the Supreme Court or in the courts, or do you think that some compromise on a nonpartisan redistricting effort becomes real?
Yeah, I haven't run into anyone yet who thinks that this is not going to get settled at the Supreme Court on either side. I think Republicans are trying a number of long shot, approaches here. I don't think any of them feel that they have a particularly high level of success. And I think this is going to get decided at the Supreme Court. I think, the question isn't, are the maps going to be less friendly for Republicans? It's going to be how much less friendly. And I've heard from various people involved on both sides of map drawing that, just given the geographic dispersal of the state, it's probably difficult to draw an assembly map that doesn't still lean Republican. But a Senate map could easily be, something resembling 50-50.
Right. And then, you mentioned it, but just before we move on, what do you think the likelihood of impeachment happening at the Supreme Court level is?
Sitting here today, really loath to make predictions sometimes, but I would say sitting here today, I think it's still less than 50-50, but I think there's a lot of things that could happen in the next few weeks that would increase those odds. I think Republicans are trying to find a way, frankly, out of it, but there is a lot of grassroots pressure on this, and they have a ticking, clock too. They need to get it done before December if it's going to have any real impact on the Supreme Court itself, instead of just getting a new appointee from the governor.
I won't ask you to answer this, but I know you, so I'll just make a statement versus asking this and not put you in a potentially delicate spot. But it occurs to me, you lived through the recalls of the Walker administration, which, I think strengthened the governor's position coming out of that one, 3 elections in as many years, right? So I just find it fascinating that, something that was proven to actually produce strength would be a tool, even a threatened tool, because it seems like it could strengthen Protasewicz's position long term.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. What you saw in 2012, there were a number of people who voted for Walker in the recall who did not vote for him in 10 and did not vote for him in 2014, but who objected to the process. So there is a significant number of voters out there who do care about things like that, and I think you would see a similar backlash in this case.
So let's we'll stay on elections, but sort of pull up or back a little bit from the palace intrigue and the something that we've talked a lot about, you and the organization, our board, about Greater Madison's influence on statewide races. We should disclose that the firm is an advocate for our organization. We do hire you to help us, and we certainly appreciate the relationship we have with you. I know you've been part of conversations with us and probably without us about how does a statewide election shake out on the Republican side with the energy and movement and momentum that we see coming out of Greater Madison's largely economy, right? It's what's driving Greater Madison right now is a robust economy. Even top GOP leaders, and we saw Governor Walker say it publicly, and after the last election, Vicki McKenna said it, Speaker Voss said it. We're seeing top Republicans saying we've got to be able to wrap our hands and our head around Dane County's growing political influence. Have you seen more conversation on this topic? Is it something that's being taken real, or is it just those immediate reactions to losing statewide?
Yeah, I think it's real in the on the campaign side of the world. The day after the election last cycle, I had a conversation with a Republican campaign operative who was very involved in one of the campaigns, and he just flat out said, he's like, I really don't know that Republicans can win statewide in Wisconsin going forward unless we kind of dramatically change the type of voter we're trying to appeal to. He was lamenting the idea of having a strategy built around trying to run up the scoreboard in the parts of the state that are shrinking and ignoring the parts of the state that are growing. And I think I think at least in campaign world where they get paid to win, they're very aware of that situation. I think there's a lag on the elected official side and the policy side. I think that they're still trying to wrap their heads around areas where they could start shifting their platform to maybe appeal while still staying true to the principles they believe in. So I think there's still some work to do on that, but there's definitely a growing awareness. And I actually think part of what's coloring the redistricting fight right now is an awareness that it's going to be very difficult to have a Republican governor anytime in the next decade. Not impossible, and you never know what might happen in terms of like a national wave. But I think Republicans are very nervous about winning statewide.
I mean, certainly we see it in the numbers. I mean, I remember Chuck Todd, pre-2022 election said, if you see Dane County go plus 51, it's going to be a good night for Democrats in Wisconsin. And it went plus 58, right?
Right.
And even more in the Protasiewicz spring election. And so, we're seeing population growth in Madison and deepening partisanship. But there's as our message is, there's an opportunity that presents itself here for Republicans. It'd be hard to win Dane County, at least in the near term. The difference between losing 58% and 38% could be the difference of a statewide election.
Absolutely. And I mean, and political coalitions change. I mean, we're really only one generation removed from a Republican governor winning Dane County. So it's, nothing's preordained or immovable. But the parties, clearly, I mean, the current Republican policy coalition is clearly not very attractive to voters in Dane County. And I think they need to think about, where they might have to change to appeal to them.
Switching to some issues, you've worked with us in DC on intercity rail. You and I, in different roles, played, sort of lived out the last time we talked about intercity rail. Fast forward more than a decade later, what do you think the chances are for bipartisan support for an investment in Wisconsin?
I would say I don't think the parties have moved much on the topic in 12 years. I think Republicans are still deeply skeptical of intercity rail in the Midwest. I think that they have a concern about the lack of sort of density in the area and the travel time between communities. That's just so different than places like the Northeast Corridor. So I think Republicans, and there's just, I think, a cultural, political/cultural issue there as well. Meanwhile, Democrats are still, I think, very supportive. So I'm a little skeptical about bipartisan success on this, but that isn't to say there can't be movement. Obviously, there's been a lot of movement in the last 3 years, and I think some of those things, once they get momentum, are harder to stop.
Yeah. Speaking of bipartisanship, you were with us when we did some, some office visits, and one of the things we brought up was childcare, both at the state level, and we brought it up at the federal level. Governor Evers calls a special session, gets gavelled in, gets gavelled out. GOP legislators pass a proposal on the topic, but it seems like we're not really falling in love with the problem. Everyone's just falling in love with their own solutions.
Yeah.
What's the latest on efforts around childcare?
I think there's actually room here for a deal. And I say deal specifically and not necessarily compromise. I think that there's probably a horse trade that's possible here. I mean, clearly the governor believes that this is an area that's underfunded. Workers are underpaid. Obviously costs for families are too high. And I think on the Republican side, I think they feel like this is much more a supply issue, that we need to make it easier to open childcare centers. We need to make it easier to operate them. We need to loosen the requirements on who can work there so that we can bring more people in. That to me looks like a classic sort of horse trade opportunity where maybe there's some more money in exchange for some loosening up of some of the regulations, and everybody can kind of get a win on that. So I thought it was really encouraging that, in the 12th special session call of the governor, they didn't simply end it, but they adjourned. And I think they're going to come back and try to pass something on childcare. Republican leaders have told me that they're interested in a conversation on this. I think Speaker Voss is, not just on this, but on a whole pile of things, desperate to negotiate and horse trade. This just seems like one where there's plenty of room for that.
That's good. Let's hope so. One that I also hope there might be some opportunity for, whether it's trading, compromising, collaboration, is the engineering building at the UW campus. I think a lot of people in the business community, this organization included, were caught off guard that it became as contentious that it did, and that it got taken out of the budget. I struggle to understand anybody who thinks that we don't need a new engineering building, and the value that it brings to the core economic engines that drive our economy, whether that's the sort of value add kind of engineering that you see in Milwaukee, or the sort of bleeding edge innovation you see here, or just the basic build great stuff that we're known for around the state. I mean, people around the world know if it's designed and engineered in Wisconsin, it's going to be a quality product. We need to be recruiting and retaining the world's best talent here to do that work for us. So what are the chances that we're going to see some traction there to I mean, it got floated during the budget of maybe there'd be a standalone bill. Maybe we'd come back and take it up. Do you think anything there is real, or are we sitting back 2 more years from now having the same conversation?
I guess I would have a little skepticism that something's going to happen this session on it. I think the idea of a standalone bill is a big lift. And some of that is more just logistics and calendar. I mean, this is already nearing the end of September. They're basically going to be around in October and November, then not at all in December, and then again in January. But I think, they're going to probably wrap up very early in February. And if the maps come back and they are, significantly worse for Republicans, I think they could shut it down even sooner. So I think some of this is just logistics. I think in terms of the longer term outlook, though, I'm pretty optimistic that in the next capital budget and next budget cycle that this project will probably get approved. I think this time around it got really caught up in a fight between Speaker Voss and the university over DEI initiatives and things like that, and this was just kind of collateral damage. When I talk to Republicans, they certainly understand the need for building out engineering capacity. So. I think, there's maybe a little bit of work to do to explain how a new building facilitates that. But, having seen the arguments for the new building, I mean, I think that's all there. I think it's just about continuing that education effort that the chamber and others have been doing. So, I'm optimistic in the long term.
Well, I'll say if there's any legislators from anywhere in the state listening, Governor Thompson gave me a tour of the engineering building to show me how bad it was. I'd be happy to give anyone else a personal tour of sort of how horrible it represents who we are and what we can be as a state. So, all right, final question. What else is on the horizon? What else should businesses be tracking, even whether if it doesn't have to be specifically just to Greater Madison? What are the other things that you're working on and that you see out there that are going to be headlines?
Yeah, I think the other two big things for the rest of the session are going to be income taxes. I think there is a deal to be had here. I think there's going to be a lot of posturing that goes on for a little while still. I think Republicans are going to probably first pass some things that they know the governor's not going to sign, but I do think there's some interest in coming back and finding some kind of middle ground on income taxes. And I think the governor's interested in that too. So I'm pretty optimistic on a deal probably in that range. And then the other big one's going to be the American Family Field funding package. That's sucking up a lot of the oxygen in the state capitol right now. I think there is a sense among the leadership that this is something that has to pass. And so, I think it's probably going to. But you really can't underestimate the amount of opposition there is. I was in a legislator's office yesterday who's been very involved in drafting the current package. And he told me that he has not had a single constituent call in favor of the package. And he's in a Southeast Wisconsin district. So I think there is going to be some issues there. I know the city and the county are worried about affording their side of the deal as well. But again, I think there's just a sense that this probably has to pass. And so I think it's going to have that momentum.
That's been my take on it too, even though it's, we're 70 some miles away. It just feels like something of like, well, there'll be a lot of hemming and hawing. In the end, it's got to get done.
Right.
Well, Ryan, thanks for everything that you do for the chamber. Thanks you do for our members, for the region. Appreciate the relationship. Thanks for taking some time to look into the crystal ball together. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, our next guest, we're going to continue on this theme of what's going on in politics and election. Our next guest is Sara Eskrich. She is the executive director of Democracy Found, which is a nonpartisan initiative committed to revitalizing American democracy. If the name sounds familiar, she was also a member of the Madison Common Council and worked on health policy in both the public and private sectors. And she previously served as a senior advisor on the Institute for Political Innovation. She's a graduate of UW-Madison, holds a master's degree in public affairs from the La Follette School, also has a master's in public health from UW School of Medicine and Public Health. Sara, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be with you guys today.
One of the things that Democracy Found, maybe the thing that Democracy Found is really pushing forward, is this idea of Final Five voting. And I know people in the business community may have heard of, instant runoff voting, Final Five voting, but I don't know that there's, it feels like every time I have a conversation about what is it. So before we even get to why it matters, can you just walk us through what is Final Five voting and how is it different than what we currently have in this country?
Yeah. So Final Five voting is a somewhat simple but brand new way to make sure that elections actually matter. So I'll tell you about it, but really the problem is that in most of our elections, as you all know, you go in and the race has already been decided by the time you're casting your general election ballot. And all too often we feel like we've got two pretty crappy choices. And so Final Five is a way to shift that electoral competition from the primary election to the general election. So you do that with two changes. So Final Five voting is the combination of a top five primary and an instant runoff general election. So specifically what I mean by that is the top five primary is a single ballot primary. So you go in and instead of having to choose if you're going to vote on the Republican column or the Democratic column, you see all your candidates and you pick your favorite. And the primary just becomes a narrowing mechanism so that the top five candidates advance to the general election. So now the general election is the place where the actual competition happens. People have real choices. And in order to manage those five candidates, people have the opportunity to rank those choices. So you can say, all right, I really like Zach. I'm going to give him my first choice vote. And I don't like any of the other candidates, so I'm going to submit my ballot like that. Or I can say, I really like Zach, but Ryan seemed pretty great too. I'll give him my second choice. Sarah's okay. I'll give her my third, and rank as many or as few choices as you want. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to get to a majority winner in the general election. Because when you tabulate a ranked ballot through an instant runoff process, you count all the first place votes first. And if someone has over 50%, they're the elected person. But if no one has over 50%, if no one has actual majority support, you drop the candidate who came in last. Anyone who voted for that candidate who is now out of the race has that voter's single vote transferred to their next favorite candidate. And that process of elimination and retabulation happens instantaneously. So we've heard about runoffs that happen in southern states. This is a way of doing a runoff to get to that same principle of majority winners should win elections through this ranked ballot and an instant runoff system so that voters don't have to keep coming back to the polling place time and time again for those runoffs. So to reiterate, Final Five voting is two changes, right? It's a top five primary and an instant general election. And we say that very specifically because there are lots of iterations of how you can improve elections. And very specifically, if our goal is to change accountability incentives in governing, we strongly believe that Final Five is the most powerful way to do that. So we can chat more about that, but Final Five voting, the combination of a top five primary and a general election.
So now we know what it is. What problem are you trying to solve with it? What is it that you, what do you want? What are you trying to change?
It's very helpful to go after Ryan because he talks about all of the challenges that are facing our state and just amplify that when we're talking about the federal government. The number of problems we have, really complex stuff that we tackle from common sense policy way as a country that so often doesn't get done because we're stuck in this gridlock where perfect is the enemy of the good. So all too often, you'll have conversations with legislators. I did this in my previous work on policy, where behind closed doors, they'll tell you, oh yeah, that compromise, right? That horse trade, as Ryan was saying, makes perfect sense. But if I vote for that, I'm in trouble because I got to go back to my county party. I got to go back and I'm effectively only accountable to my primary electorate who are voting to keep me in office or not, because so many of our seats are safe for one party or another. You can call that because of gerrymandering. You can say it because where we live is by people who think similar to us. You can explain that in various ways. But the problem is that in over 85% of our congressional races, the winner's been decided after the party primary. So effectively 8% of voters are making the decisions for all of the rest of us. And that makes it really hard for elected officials to have the freedom to do the difficult work of problem solving and governing in a way that, as you all know, as business leaders, you have to do every day. You have to find trade-offs. You have to work in the gray area between black and white. And because of our election system, because of the fear of being primaried, our elected officials don't have that same freedom. So Final Five voting is about giving them the freedom to do the difficult work that needs to be done because they aren't constantly worried about looking over their shoulder for that primary from their right or from their left.
One of the questions someone asked me recently on this is, so why are they so confident it will produce different results than our current system. So what's the answer to that? Why this? Why will this produce better results?
Yeah, well, it's all about thinking about the root cause of problems, right? So when we went through and did all the work on the root cause analysis, actually used competition tools to look at politics more like an industry, because really it is an industry. You see that it's effectively a protected duopoly with super high barriers to entry. And so ultimately, this is trying to get at that root cause problem systemically in a way that doesn't necessarily change who gets elected. So often people get confused and say, well, this isn't going to make a difference. The same people are going to get elected. And that very much may be the case. That's not what we're trying to change. We're not trying to change who gets elected. We're trying to change the incentives of how they act when they're elected and who they are accountable to in making decisions in government. So that's where the real incentive shift happens, when all of a sudden people are electorally accountable to their entire generate. So it's getting to the systematic nature of the problem that I think is so fascinating and allows us to do this work in a way that actually brings Republicans and Democrats together to work on Final Five voting, because it's not going to change who gets elected. There aren't secret partisan implications of the change. Like you see with other changes, right? Nonpartisan redistricting, you and Ryan were just talking about. The impact of these maps, we're hearing it with Republicans right now, is a fear that the maps are going to become more competitive and it's going to be a disadvantage to the Republican Party. That implication, right, even from a nonpartisan change can have partisan implications, is what I'm trying to say. But Final Five voting doesn't have those same partisan implications because it's a truly systemic change, not intended to change who gets elected, but to change the behavior of those in office.
So the effort, your organization and the effort are national, right? You've got a national focus, but what's the traction been in Wisconsin? I mean, obviously you're of Wisconsin. So
Yeah.
in your own backyard. So what have we seen around traction on an uptake? The state's no stranger to new ideas and trying to do better government. We have a legacy of it. So what are you seeing in state as far as taking hold of this as a potential new reality?
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be involved in election reform, systemic changes, and I like to remind Wisconsinites that we were first. So we were the first legislative campaign for Final Five voting in the country. We haven't succeeded yet, but we actually have bipartisan support for legislation in our state government to change the way our federal elections are run to be a Final Five system. So our bill was introduced for the first time last session. It had a hearing in the State Senate Elections Committee. We just recirculated the bill for co-sponsorship to reintroduce the session. It has bipartisan support again this session. Very few things, particularly on elections policy, have bipartisan support these days. So having that is a real differentiator for our policy compared to a lot of other changes. But we also know that in states like Wisconsin, where we have to make these changes by going through the state legislature, sometimes it just takes longer. Again, you and Ryan are talking about, sometimes change happens over multiple legislative cycles, and our legislative cycles are 2-year cycles. So the change can take time. So in the meantime, we started talking about this in Wisconsin in 2018. And other states have started to jump ahead of us. So I say we were first, but other states have jumped because they have the ability to move Final Five voting through ballot initiatives. So direct voter referendums to change their election process to Final Five voting. So where we've seen that jump ahead is in the state of Alaska and in the state of Nevada. And we will likely see more ballot initiatives for Final Five voting gaining support and traction, because when you talk to voters, they're ready for change, right? They're frustrated. They can't believe that this system continues to be the way in which we vote. And Final Five is a very common sense way to improve that. So Wisconsin is seeing some traction. It's just going to take longer because we've got a legislative process to move through in our state as compared to some of the other states across the country.
I think it's great that you're seeing the bipartisan support, and certainly applaud the effort. I mean, it should be something that it seems to me that requires both parties to talk about. You talked about a duopoly, and so I guess that, sort of ultimately, I hear and believe what you're saying, which is we're not trying to change who gets elected. We're trying to change how they get elected. But how does it get to a point where, particularly when if there is no direct legislative action that's available to the people, how do we get the political parties to not stand in the way of getting broader bipartisan support? It seems to me that will be the final barrier, that you'll get bipartisan support from select legislators. My guess is you'll get the public, once they understand it, to see it as a better solution. Is it we just have to wait for a tipping point to get the parties to do that, or is there a way to get the parties to get ahead of the tipping point?
Yeah, it is helpful to us in some ways that the pressure of factionalization that's happening within the parties is getting as acute and painful as it is. Because again, back to the comment that Ryan made earlier, the pressure that elected officials are getting on elections policy is sincere, and Republicans in particular are having a hard time. And when you think about these statewide races where all of a sudden you're trying to figure out how to be competitive in a purple state like Wisconsin, but a partisan primary is determining who your candidate is, it could be really hard to get someone who's electable in that general election. Right. So we can start talking politics around this, and the conversation shifts with party operatives and with the political industrial complex, as we sometimes lovingly refer to them, because these are people who, to your point, are often most resistant to change because they understand the current system, they know how to win in the current system, so why would they want to change? But as we're moving forward, that is less and less the case, that they are understanding how to win in the current system, that the current system is working for them. And so all of a sudden, as happens with any sort of change, right, as it gets worse and worse, all of a sudden people are more and more open to thinking differently. And so we're seeing that shift with legislators, and we're seeing that shift with people who have traditionally been very involved in partisan politics, because they're seeing all of those factors that you all just talked about, the influence of Dane County in politics statewide. If all of a sudden, just for example, in Dane County, we had Final Five voting for our Senate race, see more candidates that would appeal to independents, moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans in Dane County to get them to turn out. Because right now, if you're a Republican in Dane County, you don't have a very exciting choice on your ballot, right? There's not a lot of reason, and your vote isn't going to matter relatively. You're going to be so outnumbered by everyone else in this county. But if you give people a reason to show up, to give their first and second choice vote to people, again, it doesn't necessarily change who gets elected, but it certainly changes who's being listened to, because their voice starts to matter in the process in a really powerful way. Yep. And so, very long answer to that question, but politics plays into all this stuff, right? And so as politics is what it is and the challenges are what they are, I think we're seeing a real difference in the conversations that we're able to have.
So we know, because the people who register for this, we don't have as clear about who watches it later, and a lot of people do, but we know that for the people who register this, it's some political people, news media, but the vast majority of the people that are listening to us talk right now are from the business community. And my guess is some number of them are going, this is all interesting, but what does this have to do with business? Why are they talking about this? So why should the business community care about this issue?
Yeah, it's not very easy to run a business when you're in a totally unstable political environment, because that means your business environment is unstable. Right. I mean, it comes down to that at a fundamental level, and having stability in the regulatory environment and the business environment that you're operating in, and the ability to tackle some of these really complicated problems. We're hearing federally all the time about immigration, and we know there are common sense solutions that the business community is demanding when it comes to immigration reform, that just can't get done because of the nature of party primaries in our country and the lack of flexibility and freedom that legislators have to do that important problem solving. So when it gets to those really big issues that impact you on a macro and even micro level of who you can hire, we need a stable, we need a reasonable, we need a pragmatic political environment where problems can be solved. And more so, we're seeing that just is not able to happen because of the polarization. And so, again, this is a case where the worse and worse it gets, the more and more the business community recognizes that silence and not being leaders in this space is going to come back to bite us. And so people are showing leadership and having these conversations because your voices are incredibly powerful, especially on issues like this where you aren't traditionally leaders, but can say, we get systems, we get root cause, we understand incentives and accountability, and we understand that this current system is not working and it's time to think about something different.
So, the two leaders that we've had the most connectivity, you came and talked to us, I think, well, multiple years ago. The pandemic makes it blurry.
In the before times.
That's right. And it was you and Catherine Gale, who I've known Catherine for 16 years. You were a endorsed alder by the chamber. And so neither one of you are hyper partisan people, but you're the thought leaders behind Democracy Found. I thought one of the strongest cases that you made in the room many years ago was that none of this will change unless big institutions, and business being an institution, puts its weight behind the change and saying enough is enough. We can't allow some small percentage of the electorate to define our political outcomes, or worse, create instability. Business thrives in stability, right? We like predictable, the economy may not always be the way we want. Policy may not always be the way we want, but if you tell us the rules, we'll work within it, right? And I thought it was one of the strongest arguments that you made, which is that institutions are going to have to be the next step of this. They're going to have to. And so I make a little news today that this morning at our board meeting, our board of directors passed our 3-year advocacy agenda. And in there is proactive and clear support for Final Five voting. And so I just want to say your message got across. It was probably one of the most hotly debated topics internally about what is the role and why, and of all the things we got to get done, is this the place that we can afford to or should put resources, and just let it work itself out. And of course it's a good idea, but it seems like somebody else's problem. But your message to our board, which is a very diverse group of CEOs and business leaders, 48 of the most prominent companies in this region have signed off on, we need a better way, and we think that this is a better way. So congrats from them.
Congrats to you all, because that's leadership, right? That is leadership, and recognizing that it's actually the root cause of all the other challenges and all the other policy problems that you're going to work on. If you have an accountable election system that creates stability and pragmatic problem solving and governing, guess what? All the other things get easier. So thank you.
We're on board.
Fabulous news.
That is good news. So we're on board. So what happens next? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so the bill's circulating right now for co-sponsorship, which means now is the time, if you have relationships with state legislators, to have conversations, particularly knowing who's in control of the state legislature. We need continued Republican leadership on this, to be blunt. And so we've got bipartisan support. We need to make sure that we grow that support and continue to show that this is something that is really the root cause. So again, if you have relationships, now is the time to make the call. And we do expect committee hearings this session in both the Assembly and the Senate. So at that point, we would love to follow up about conversations about testimony and outreach at that time, but let's do it in a position of power with lots of strong co-sponsors on the bill. And now's the time for that over the next 2 weeks.
Sounds like a plan. I want to thank Sarah, you for joining us. Thanks to our previous guest, Ryan Murray, for joining us. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. These are important conversations now and for the future. As always, I'd like to thank our sponsors, in particular our presenting sponsor, Perkins Coie, for supporting this and making it happen. And we'll see you next time here on Lunch Update.